Greetings once again, ghouls, and welcome back to the Vault of All Things EC. Today I want to talk about the legendary Gaines file copies. And you'll see, as with all legends, they're based on truth, but there's a lot of misinformation and stuff that gets out there over the years. So the legend has it that Bill Gaines cherry-picked 12 of the nicest copies of every EC he could find, wrapped them in butcher paper, and didn't touch them for decades. That's mostly true, but in many cases, he had gotten into those packages over the years for trades or even to give away, the most famous example being the copy of Shock Illustrated number 3 that he gave to Russ Cochran in the 60s. And that was to complete Russ's collection of ECs. It was the only EC that he didn't have, and lo and behold, in 1989, when they opened up the package of Shock Illustrated number 3, there were 11 copies, because Bill had set aside 12, but he gave one away in the 60s to Russ. There's lots of other examples of that. Who knows exactly where they all went, but in many, many cases, there were fewer than 12 copies of any given issue, and it was very common to have 7, 8, or 9 copies of an issue. And in one case, Vault of Horror number 12, that's the first issue of the Vault of Horror, there was only one copy. There was only one copy in the Gaines files when they opened everything up. So when he did offer them for initial sale, Russ Cochran sent out this brochure to his subscribers, the Gaines EC File Copies Introduction, and there's a lot of great information in here, and it also came with a master list of how many copies of each issue there were, which is invaluable information now, so many decades after. It's nice to know how many should actually be out there of every given issue, right? So even at 12, they're exceedingly rare. There's not that many out there, and they are grail items for EC collectors. The other thing that was included with this informational packet was a price list. And I'll tell you how the sale worked. So let's say that there were 12 copies of any given issue. The 1 through 5 copies were offered in full sets. Russ Cochran thought that collectors would want to buy a full run of a title, and he wanted them to have the nicest copies. So the 1 through 5 copies were offered as full sets. The lower graded copies, and when I say graded, keep in mind, they're all mint copies, but the numbering system was Bob Overstreet's visual ranking. So the top and bottom copies of a pile of comics might have gotten a few little dings or creases, which made them the lesser copies. So the 12, 11, 10, and 9 copies went to the Gaines family. Bill didn't care if they had the nicest copies, he just wanted them to have full sets. So that was his wife Annie, his 2 daughters, and his son. And so 4 copies of each to the Gaines family, 5 copies to full sets. That only left the middle copies, 6, 7, and 8. Again, assuming there were 12 copies found, 6, 7, and 8 were offered initially as single copies. I won't get into the price list that Russ Cochran sent out because it'll make you cry, but I will give you an example. Crime Suspense Stories number 22, kind of a valuable comic these days. And initially, they did unwrap 12 copies, meaning that the 6, 7, and 8 copies were sold as singles, and the price list has them at $200 each. So you can take it from there, and that was a long time ago, remember. Nowadays, Gaines file copies, the sky's the limit as far as what you might see them go for, depending on what the issue is. They are highly sought after. They are grail items for EC collectors. Let's take a look at one. This is extra number 4. This is a Gaines file copy, and it is the number 5 copy, meaning that at one time this was in a full set. But those sets have been broken up and sold long ago, which is why, you know, the 1 through 12 might be available out there on the collector's market now, because even the Gaines family did part out their sets at some point. And so the 1 through 5 copies, you know, you had one of what was considered the nicest copies in a full set at one point. And if you've got, you know, a 9, 10, 11, or 12 copy, you know that you've got one that probably belonged to a Gaines family member at one point. Here is the certificate. It's an engraved certificate. It's signed by Bill Gaines, Bob Overstreet, and Russ Cochran, and it has a number. So as you can see, this copy of extra number 4 is the 5 of 12 copy, and they were originally offered with a Mylar, which would have a number that matches the certificate. So here you've got the certificate numbered 5 of 12, along with a Mylar that has a computer-printed label that's also numbered 5 of 12. So if you have a Gaines file copy, it should always have the certificate, and ideally it would have the Mylar with the matching number. And in the information that Russ sent out, he said, don't ever separate the certificates from the comics. Unfortunately, a lot of the certificates have been separated from the comics. And one of the stories out there is that in the early days, CGC felt that their header label that said Gaines file copy was provenance enough. And to this day, I think their website says that they don't always return supplemental information, including COAs, with the comic books. They don't guarantee that you'll get those back. And in many, many cases, there are slabbed, graded Gaines file copies out there that are missing the certificates. I personally feel like I wouldn't buy a Gaines file copy without the certificate. You can still rest assured that you've got a beautiful copy of an EC comic, but is it really, really a Gaines? You know, if you've got a certificate with a raw comic, I've heard the argument that, hey, anyone could take a high-grade EC and put a certificate with it. Yes, they could, but I've also heard of cases where I know that there were slabbed high-grade ECs that weren't designated as pedigree copies that were cracked out, resubmitted, and it was asked that they be looked at to see if they might be a Gaines, and they came back with the Gaines designation. Are those really Gaines file copies? I'm not here to start anything. I'm just going to say that if you've got the comic and the certificate, and again, ideally, the numbered Mylar, then you can be reasonably sure that this is the real deal. But conspiracy theories aside, they are the most perfect, pristine copies of EC comics in existence. They smell of fresh printer's ink. They are Grail items, again, for EC collectors. And if you've got one, you know that you've got not only one of the nicest examples of an EC comic in existence, you've got one that Bill Gaines himself personally set aside and preserved all those years. So if you've got any questions or comments or anything, go ahead and leave them for me. If there's anything you'd like to see me cover in the world of EC, I could talk about this stuff all day, and I frequently do. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.